Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about how we can build background knowledge for our students. Let's start off by defining what background knowledge is. Background knowledge is also known as prior knowledge, and it is all of the experiences, the information, and the understandings that we already have and we carry with us into the reading of a text. I like to think about it as those pieces of the puzzle. What pieces of knowledge do I already have with me that will help me make connections to a text that I am reading? Background knowledge is very important to becoming a skilled reader. In fact, it makes up, it's one of the pieces of the language comprehension strand of Scarborough's reading rote. Now, background knowledge supports learning in many ways. One of the main ways is through improving the reading comprehension. You better understand something when you have some background knowledge that you can connect your new learning to. It leads to better recall and better memory of what students are learning. It increases their vocabulary because, of course, when you know more about something, you're learning more words that are related to that topic. It reduces the cognitive load for our students so they become faster and more efficient in their learning. It leads to higher achievement across subject areas because, of course, we know that there's a lot of learning that crosses over those subject areas. So when our students have that background knowledge, then they're going to be able to apply it in more than just the subject that they are learning it in. It leads to improved writing because when we have a good understanding of something, it's easier for us to write about that and we have that vocabulary available to us to access in our writing. It leads to increased engagement and motivation when students learn about something, they've got some knowledge about it, and they're really interested in it. They might be a little bit more engaged, and they also are going to be motivated to learn more. And it helps students to make inferences. Now, when we make inferences, we're drawing conclusions based on the background knowledge that we already have, and then the evidence that the author has presented in the text. We know that an author can't tell us everything or explain everything that they are writing about. And so they assume that their readers have an amount of background knowledge that lets them, enter into the text and draw and have some basic understandings, but then they present more text evidence that then as the readers we can combine to make those inferences and draw those conclusions and feel confident that our conclusion is actually accurate. So let me take you to my classroom and talk about how I would work with my students on background knowledge in a simple example of read aloud time. So I've taught 4th and 5th grade, and read aloud was always a very popular time in my classroom. It was a chance that I could use to help build my students' background knowledge along with many, many other reading comprehension skills, building vocabulary, that sort of thing. So I always read the book Hatchet to my students, and my students were really fortunate enough to have some background knowledge because they lived in Montana, they lived in Minnesota, and they came to this book with some knowledge of things that existed. So let's talk about the story Hatchet. Hatchet is a story about a boy named Brian, and it takes place in the 1980s. Brian is 13 years old, and he has been involved in a plane crash in the Canadian wilderness. He spends 54 days surviving with only a hatchet as his main tool that he could use to get through that. So going into this story, my students had a lot of background knowledge because there are things that they already knew about that then were reflected in this story. Water, okay? The plane crashed into the water, and my students live, especially my Minnesota students, the land of 10,000 lakes. They know what a lake, what a river, what a stream is like. The dense forest. Both my students in both school districts that I worked in had very familiar with what exists in a dense forest, which will include things like a bear, moose, and of course, mosquitoes. My students are also aware of a tornado, and a tornado is something that occurs in the story of Hatchet, and so they could have some understanding of what Brian might have been experiencing when that tornado came through in the story. So reading about Hatchet, I could assume that my students had a nice amount of background knowledge that they could connect the story to. So when Brian encountered a bear, or he encountered, a moose, or he was miserable from the mosquito bites, my students could say, oh, I kind of get that. I can understand that. Which then allowed for them to add to their background knowledge and for us to have some really nice, rich discussions about what was happening in the story. And it just made it obviously very, very enjoyable for my students. So much so that they got engaged in it. And because Hatchet is the first of 5 stories about Brian, my students then, of course, wanted to read on and learn more. And I often saw them picking up the other books that made up that series. Now I want to contrast that with another book that I read to my students. This book is The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle. It's about a 13-year-old girl, but it occurred in 1832. Charlotte Doyle was, like I said, a 13-year-old girl. She came from high society in England, so she had to follow a lot of societal rules, some gender expectations of what she could do and how she was expected to behave. She was the only passenger on a ship traveling from England to Rhode Island, and she was the only girl. Through a series of misfortunate things, she ended up on the wrong ship traveling over to Rhode Island. And it's just a thrilling tale of a treacherous sea voyage. Now, where my students had a lot of background knowledge about what was happening with 13-year-old Brian, they didn't quite have that amount of background knowledge when they were learning about 13-year-old Charlotte. So we needed to build that background knowledge. We needed to, again, have those rich discussions, but also do a little bit of investigating. Some of my students maybe had read other stories that were related to this time period, so they brought some of that background knowledge into the story. But we had to work on some of that to get my students prepared to listen to and have discussions about this story. But then when they were finished, they had more puzzle pieces in their brain about this particular time period. Important activity, and read aloud is a great way to help build that background knowledge with your students. So what are some ways we can build background knowledge, either with our students or if we have some parents watching, what can you do with your children? Well, firsthand experiences is a great way to build background knowledge. Going on those field trips to museums and visiting parks and zoos and libraries and attending community events as a family and enrolling in learning camps and that sort of thing are all great ways to build background knowledge. I've said it a few times here today, but having those rich conversations, engaging students in rich conversations about topics they're learning about. I really like the idea of engaging them in conversations with their elders, teaching them how to ask really good questions and have those conversations with again, their elders or with experts, and discussions about current events. All of that continues to build background knowledge for our kiddos, putting more puzzle pieces into their brains. Getting them involved in everyday activities. In the classroom, it might be different duties, different jobs that they have been assigned, different routines that they follow. And then at home, getting them involved in everyday activities around, cooking and shopping and gardening and different home projects that you are doing. All help to build that understanding and that background knowledge. And then immersing our students in family and culture, not only their family and their cultures and traditions, but also encouraging curiosity about other families and other cultures that they might not be as familiar with. And then also engaging them in interest-based learning, finding out what are their hobbies, what are they interested in, what do they want to know more about, and then giving them those opportunities. And then, of course, that exposure to diverse topics all across the spectrum of science to history to geography, arts, music, technology, all of those different topics, building up opportunities for them to build knowledge based on those areas. So, like I said, firsthand experiences is a great way to build background knowledge. However, what do we do with our students who don't have those firsthand experiences? One of the most important things we can do is we can read with them, okay? Read with your students, read with your children, and engage them in those rich discussions. Reading and knowledge building is a reciprocal relationship, okay? We've talked a lot here today. Knowledge supports reading comprehension, and reading supports knowledge building. So it is a cycle of growth, and neither one of these should exist separately, right? We shouldn't just do knowledge building. We shouldn't just do reading. We should be doing both, okay? They should not exist separately. Instruction should be occurring in both areas. And also, you should not wait for mastery of word reading skills before you work on knowledge building and comprehension. They all are part of the process. They all are part of this cycle, and they should be a part of your students' reading and learning experiences. So let's talk about how we can build background knowledge using Read Naturally solutions. The beautiful part of all of our programs is that they include informational text. Read Naturally Live and Read Naturally Live Espanol, 1 Minute Reader Live, Word Warm-Ups Live, Gate Plus, Comprehension Builder, Word Warm-Ups, Take Aim at Vocabulary are all solutions that can be used in school and include that informational text that really helps build background knowledge. And then for those parents at home, 1 Minute Reader Home is also a way that you can use to build that background knowledge using those informational texts. And the beautiful part about all of these stories is they provide that exposure to the diverse topics that we just talked about that really help expand our students' knowledge. You know, learning about all those different things like different traditions and history and geography and literature and music, all of that stuff, you can find stories related to those topics in the Read Naturally programs. And the added bonus is when students then learn about these new topics, you can have those nice, engaged, rich conversations to then further expand or solidify their understanding. So now I want to demonstrate to you or show you a way that you can use the informational texts, such as those found in Read Naturally Solutions, to help your students expand their background knowledge. If you ask your students, give them a choice to choose a story that they are particularly interested in, you now have your topic to then continue to do additional activities. In my example today, the student chose the story The Power of Water, which is a story about the Grand Canyon, and it comes in at, I think, a level 4.0. After the student has chosen their topic, you can make some sort of a folder. You could either do a manila folder or you could do a digital folder, someplace where they're going to gather and create and sort and organize all of the information that they are learning about this topic. So here our student has chosen that Power of Water story and they've made a folder for the Grand Canyon. Once you've read that story, or the student has read that story, or maybe you've read that story together, you can work with them or they can work independently and pick 3 vocabulary words that they want to know more about. What was in the story that they're kind of interested in? So for this particular story, the student has chosen canyon, ancient, and formations. And so teaching them how to find the meaning of those words, whether they're using the before, the sentence that it was in and the sentence that came before or after to figure out the meaning, using the glossary or an online dictionary, whatever it is, they figure out what the meaning of the word is, and then they use that word in a sentence. And you could have them do that in writing, or if you're working at home with your child, they could use that word in a sentence that they just speak to you orally. But we're going to expand their vocabulary with some key words that they have chosen from the passage that they want to learn more about. And then the next step is that they're going to go out there and learn more. You know, head to the library and check out some books. There's an example here, the Grand Canyon book by Jason Chin. There is also an example of a website put out by, the National Park Service on the Grand Canyon, a great place for them to gather new information. And as they're learning more, you're going to want to continue to encourage them, like, what do you still wonder about? What else do you want to find out? And then guide them in learning more. So they're just continuing to add their new knowledge into that folder to organize and think about the new things that they have learned. And throughout all of this, you're having those rich discussions with the students or with your child. You're talking about, what have you learned? Like I said, what do you wonder about? What do you want to know more about? So really engaging with them beyond asking simple questions like, did you like learning about the Grand Canyon? That's too easy. Instead you're going to want to say, Tell me what you've learned about the Grand Canyon. What did you find particularly interesting and why? That sort of thing. Really engaging in those conversations helps to solidify the learning and the background knowledge. And then reaching for an experience. Now, of course, you likely wouldn't be able to go visit the Grand Canyon unless you lived close by, but there are so many resources available online for these virtual field trips. So the National Park Service actually has a virtual field trip for the Grand Canyon. And so the student can then experience this, because we know those firsthand experiences help to, again, strengthen and solidify that understanding. But if it's a topic that you do have something locally or in your area that you can then go and experience firsthand to learn more about the topic that they have chosen, that is a great way to solidify their understanding. And then finally, encouraging your student or the child that you're working on this with to then put their new learnings together. Create a diorama or a PowerPoint presentation or Google slideshow or some sort of an iMovie where they take all of that information they've gathered in their folder, they have organized it, and now they're going to present their learning to somebody else. If you're working in the family, invite grandma and grandpa over and say, Jacob wants to tell you everything about the Grand Canyon. Or in the classroom, provide those opportunities for the students to then share their new learning with everybody else. And by giving our students the opportunity to participate in activities like this, we have built background knowledge. We've added more puzzle pieces to their brain so they have a little bit more information. And we did this through the use of informational text, those rich conversations, the exposure to those diverse topics, and giving them choice on what they want to learn more about, with that interest-based learning happening because they got to choose what they wanted to study. And we've increased their vocabulary, which will increase their comprehension as they continue to read and learn more about a topic or a related topic that ties into what they investigated. So we're going to wrap up today just revisiting that cycle, remembering that reciprocal relationship between background knowledge, right? Background knowledge is going to support reading comprehension, and reading is going to support knowledge building. So it's just really important that we give our students lots of opportunities to read, because that's going to lead to more knowledge, which is going to support greater comprehension, and then our cycle will just continue on through. All right, thank you for joining me today, and I hope you found this helpful. If you have other ideas on how you work to expand your students' background knowledge, please share those in the comments so everyone can learn from one another. Thank you.